how regulators work together, which has been a theme of discussion. And there are two questions which I think I'll take it as one. One is about data. So how do we overcome the hurdles in different jurisdictions around privacy and sharing of data? So if one regulator is sharing data with another, how do we overcome that issue? And the second is, can one regulatory body trust another regulatory body in terms of the reliability of what it does? So I guess that also means recognition of decisions on sanctions and complaints, as well as recognition of the decisions and data. So who would like to have a go at that first?
Shall I take
Yeah, do.
data?
Elliot,
that came
please.
from our discussions. So I think in terms of the data and data sharing, we talked about that and the concerns around it, but I think it's incumbent on us as regulators to make sure we do share the data. If you look at other sectors in terms of how they've managed to control that data sharing, it's yes, you can put sort of security checks in terms of the checks and balances from a systems point of view, but a lot of it comes down to the cultural way of working with that data and making sure that you've got the right people, the right checks in place. It's two people working on it, on the data sets, for example, making sure that nothing goes awry with those. There's also perhaps things about data compartmentalisation as well, because there's a lot of concern about somebody could get hold of a big data set, somebody called Snowden, for example, pull the data sets together and then do something evil with them. And again, part of that, and again, if you look at some of the other sectors, intelligence and security sectors, for example, they're very good at making sure that certain people only have access to certain pieces of data, so they can't piece the whole thing together. So there's things like that you can do around that, but I think it's fundamentally it's about making sure you've got the right checks and balances in place, not just technical ones, because often the problems occur when you've got systems administrator who decides they're just going to hoover all the data out of the system and do horrible things and release it. So that was my thought around it. I don't think we should necessarily, there are lots of issues to overcome, but given the size of the prize in terms of actually what you can do with those data sets, I think there's really ways in which you can risk manage that and do it well.
Neil, I know the GMC and CQC and all of us have been thinking hard and working hard on this in the UK since the Francis report. What do you...
So, I mean, there are two, I think, separate issues here that data has thrown up. The first, as Harry alludes to, is that within countries such as the UK, I think the expectation of professional regulators in the past might have been that we were, to some extent, isolated from the system. We were concerned with individual doctors, and we dealt with individual doctors as the problems of an individual doctor came to us. That set of expectations has just been blown out of the water. We're now absolutely seen as being part of the system. Mike Richards mentioned this morning about our survey of doctors in training, or junior doctors are sometimes called, and how that they are using that as a means of, and they can correlate the results of that with other patient safety data, and it is one of the most powerful measures of how well a hospital is doing. Not surprisingly, is the people who are on the front line and who are doing that. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think internationally the challenges are, I mean, they're not different, but there are different aspects to this. The first is that, and I think we've made quite a bit of progress around this, is establishing trust. That was your point. And trust is sometimes through having memorandum of understanding between two different regulators, where they understand, first of all, what does a certificate about an individual doctor mean when it comes from that body? What is it actually saying, and what is it not saying? And once you have a proper memorandum of understanding between two, I'm not suggesting every regulator needs an MOU with every other one, but certainly ones where there is a flow of doctors running from one to the other, then it makes absolute sense. And at AMRA, we've promoted this. We've got a template MOU, and we've also got good practice examples of what the certificates that issuing, or the one who's saying goodbye to the doctor should be issuing to the one who's receiving it. I think we can use information in that. Quite granular, it's quite pedestrian, you might say, but it's really important. And certainly for countries that are receiving doctors, having a degree of assurance that from another regulator that they're going through a proper process and that doctor has got a proper certificate of good standing, from that other regulator, I think is really important. And the third area is around, again, IAMRA has done quite a bit of work on this, some of you, many of you I'm sure are aware of, is the idea of how far as regulators are we, or should we, proactively share information about doctors about whom we have problems. Now, and again, I think we're all at different stages on this journey. The GMC produces a monthly list of all the doctors who we have taken action against, and it's fine, but frankly, I'm not sure how much use it is, because how many other regulators would go down these lists and so forth. So I think there's a lot more all of us can do, but absolutely, and I absolutely would urge any IAMRA members here, there is the thing we passed at the last General Assembly 2 years ago, a statement of intent around the proactive sharing of information. We've got quite a few signatures. We still need some more. I think just encouraging people who are saying, we will be active, we will push out information. We're not prepared to take action against the doctor and then seeing that doctor wander off somewhere else and start doing harm to patients in other areas. And so I think these smaller steps are also really important.
And Margaret, before I ask you also, there's another question here that you, as the professional representative, might. It says, how do regulatory authorities overcome resistance from doctors regarding information being included on a public register system? Welcome, Malcolm.
Can I just say that I think there's a very big, we've had developments within the last 10, 15 years, even in low-income countries, where there's a movement to try and get everybody to understand why regulation is important and that we need to be protecting patients and not protecting ourselves as doctors or health professionals. I think there's a very big wind of change, and I think that's very positive. And I think it's the work that the IMRA is doing, I think is one way of getting, both sides of the world, because there is some sort of divide, but getting the world together and people beginning to talk and share and learn from each other. And I think these workshops that we've been having, probably you had since yesterday, are workshops that are very useful in getting both sides of the world to sort of try and understand each other and learn from each other. And I think, as I said, that the perceptions that we have, that regulators, the regulatory fraternity has, and the professionals have, and I think it's getting narrower. The gap is getting narrower. I think we are seeing more people beginning to talk to each other and try to understand each other. So yes, you might have resistance, but I think we are getting there. With a lot of collaboration and networking and learning from each other, we are getting there. From low-income countries, professionals learning from professionals and organized groups in developed countries or in high-income countries. We're learning from each other. And I think we're beginning to see the gap closing. So yes, there will be resistance, and there is a tendency to want to protect our own. But I think we are getting there. I think that things are moving and moving in the right direction, and I think we should continue this sort of sharing ideas, and between the service providers and the regulators meeting together and beginning to talk to each other. Yeah. I think is something in the right direction.
And I've got a couple of questions now that have come from the groups as well, both of which are about international mobility. One is just how the regulatory systems need to change to adapt to the growing hypermobility of medical professionals. I think that means not just moving from one country to another, but moving from one country and then to a third country and then on. So the person has come around a route through several countries before they finish up. But the other one, which I think is also a real challenge, it's about, what about refugees, people who are coming from war zones, people who have escaped oppression and maybe have lost all their papers, lost their identity, lost their qualification certificates back in their home countries. The institutions that trained them have collapsed. What can we do for those people, apart from, I have to say, in most of our Western countries, give them jobs as taxi drivers if they get jobs at all? Who wants to have a go at?
Can I just say that I think a lot is to do with the training. If we start with training, the basic training, and make sure that that health professionals understand their obligations and understand that the rights of patients have rights to be protected. I think even when they do become refugee, because if you look at, even when they do become refugee, they're more likely to appreciate the need to abide, or what may not be in their favor at that particular time. So a lot is to do with at what stage do we start making people understand their obligations and not, which I think is very, very important. And many of those people come from refugee. We're going to be refugee are coming from low-income countries where the efforts need to be much more in terms of making people to understand. So it's part of their culture, and they do understand when they're forbidden or when they're stopped from working, that, we need to protect, and they understand that. We need to protect the population, and take it much more better than they would have taken otherwise.
Neil, do you?
Well, I mean, it is now working. I think it is. It's obviously a challenge if somebody hasn't got any papers and so forth. But I think that probably as regulators we should be flexible enough, at least to allow people to possibly sit our entrance exams or whatever else, if they can demonstrate in some other way, or they have some information. I know we've had issues before where because of the circumstances in which the individual arrived, we've bent over backwards to find other ways of getting verification about what it is that they're saying. And obviously that's, as you say, sometimes very difficult. But then there are people who know them and that kind of thing. So there are ways you can sometimes get around that. But of course you would also require them to meet the standards that you required before you practice, because your first objective must be to protect patients in this country.
So I'm going to move on to two other groups of questions. One is about the tension in some regulatory systems between the needs of workforce planning and the role of the regulator. And, we know, for instance, in APRA in Australia, it actually has workforce written into its legal framework, that it's required to secure a sufficient supply. And there's debate about we've also heard about is it better to have a second-rate doctor than no doctor? Probably, in my view, not, but some people think there might be. There is a correlation, I'm told, between the number of doctors and the amount of illness. So the more doctors you have, the more illness there is.
You discover.
So the question is, is there a tension that can be resolved between regulation and workforce planning? Is that Malcolm?
I was wondering before I came to the conference today what would be said during it about the situation in Liberia. Desperately short of any sufficient supply of medical personnel to deal with the Ebola outbreak in the capital, Texas being the principal form of contagion. And I don't know if you had a regulator there insisting on the standards, how they would be recognized right now. I think we'd all accept that during a crisis, you use your discretion. You'd probably accept a lot of volunteers, give them minimal particular training, and send them into action. I'm not very good at these questions about supply. That's economics. It's a different type of work. It's not really risk control. But what I can tell you from other fields, what happens when agencies have what's generally known as a dual mandate. It's quite common, in fact, that they are responsible. The FAA in America, when it was formed, was given a dual mandate. They were responsible for airline safety, and they were responsible for promoting the airline industry. There's clearly a potential conflict of interest there to let airlines go be profitable even while they're misbehaving. You only need one bad year and you get the supply side of your dual mandate stripped away. It's it happens historically. So it happened to the FAA in 1996, a very bad year, 3 major crashes in America, 3 different major airlines, and Congress said, okay, enough. You're no longer responsible for promoting the industry. You are unambiguously focused on safety. Don't ever get confused about that. Let somebody else worry about promoting the airline industry. The same happened to the mineral management, whatever it was called before the Gulf oil spill. With BP, it was responsible for regulating the rigs for safety, for promoting the oil industry and exploration, and for collecting revenues from the industry. And then when the scandal all breaks, it looks like obvious set of conflicts within their mandate. They get fragmented, broken up, and solitary focus. Fascinating case in Canada along these lines. I think 2 or 3 years ago, there was a nuclear power plant whose safety regulation turned out not to be as good as people had hoped, and they revised their assessments of a meltdown from 1 in a billion, which is what it's supposed to be, to 1 in a million, which is unacceptable. And the response from the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or whatever it's called in Canada, was, well, we can't shut down that plant because they supply half of the world's medical isotopes. And if we shut that plant down, people will die from lack of radiation treatment all over the globe. Then the commissioner had to resign, and I think in Canada what happened is people recognized that trade can't be made by one regulator. That's got to be elevated into the political realm. But if any medical regulator has a dual mandate, I guarantee one huge scandal, it will be stripped away. People will recognize the potential conflict.
Neil.
That's my guess.
I guess the first thing to say is quite glad we don't have a workforce, especially having listened to that, having a workforce responsibility. But of course, the reality is that we work in the real world. And so we can't regulate, and especially as someone, as an organization responsible for education regulation, we have to be conscious that the people we're regulating will work in a system. And therefore, there's no use producing people who are not of any use to patients at the end of that. And of course, employers have a very important role in saying, this is the sort of thing that we want, that this is what society needs, and so on. So we're not absolutely pure in this regard. Of course, others will decide numbers going into this process and so forth. But we've got a big debate going on in this country, and I think it's going in other places, about the degree of specialization, for example, in medicine, and whether that degree of specialization ultimately is for the good of patients. It's also obviously a critical workforce question about how many you have and so on, and where the shortages lie. So while I'm very glad we don't actually have direct workforce responsibilities, I also recognize, and I think a lot of regulators will find this, you work in the reality of a body politic, and you have to accept that you work in that world. The sort of tensions you get, and I guess a lot of developing countries would recognize this one, which is that even in a country like the UK, you get very remote rural areas where it's very difficult to find doctors, and that question of a not very good doctor versus a no doctor at all absolutely comes up, and that question is put. Of course, the other question is you're putting possibly not very good and not very well supported doctors in the most isolated environments, in the most vulnerable positions. So I think there are also real questions that should be asked of employers in that regard as well.
Margaret.
Could I just say that I think we can't have double standards. I think if you look at the Ebola question, many more people die of HIV/AIDS and malaria in Africa than they die of Ebola. And I just want to say, if we start saying we become a bit more, lower the standards for people coming in to help, then of course we're going to have to do it for everything. I mean, there are bigger problems Africa has, for example, than the Ebola crisis that we are seeing now. There are very many people dying from, childbirth-related conditions, and women die, very big numbers. And I think what we need to do is that what we are trying to do is to make sure that we work towards the same standards and that we protect our people and make sure that even in a crisis, we do protect our people. And I think that is important. And it's one thing saying you have a few health professionals, you have a shortage, therefore you allow everybody in. You're probably more likely to have people dying. Mortalities go up. So, we've got to keep the standards, and we've got to be working towards the standards and not have two worlds where one has, people can walk in and do what they want, and another area where you keep the standards. I think we need to be working towards the same standards. The challenges are there, resources, perceptions, but we need to work on these. And I think it's the fora, like every time you come and you talk together as two different worlds, that you begin to see that there's need for us to be working towards those standards. Cost is a challenge. The whole issue of the fact that the brain drain is there and it's massive, but the disease burden is so huge that we can't afford to worsen it by having double standards. I think we need to keep the same standards. And I think we should be just looking at trying to save as many people as we can in areas like that.
Elliot, do you have anything?
Yeah, just one point to add to that really as well. I think it's also important to think about the use of technology as well. So again, we've talking about people in remote places, but again, thinking about the use of Skype and technologies like that, that's another approach to it that we might want to look at as regulators in terms of promoting that as a way forward. I'm still not saying it's the answer face-to-face, but where there is scarcity, then we should be looking at that as an alternative.
Okay, so our time is up. I'm going to ask Neil both for his final comment on that, but also as the incoming chair of EAMRA, if he'd reflect on, this session this afternoon, we've really tried to focus on the fundamentals to help those of you who are here who are trying to build regulatory systems, but also I have to say I hope to try and remind those of us who are in more sophisticated and long-standing systems that it's a good idea to do what Malcolm did this morning and tell us to think about whether we really know what we're doing. So, Neil, I wonder if you could comment on
Thank you.
that.
Just a final last point on that. I was just struck by a participant from Pakistan who was saying to me just before I came in here about the problem of facing a disaster, and then all these teams come from around the world, and the difficulty you have in trying to very quickly assess whether, these guys may be knights in shining armor, but they may not be, and they may not actually have the skills for the things that they're doing. And that makes people in those situations even more vulnerable as a result of the intervention. So, and I know Médecins Sans Frontières has also faced that challenge. So lots of volunteers, but how good are the volunteers and so on? And I think that's a sign of the growing maturity of regulation, that people are starting to ask these questions, even in some of the most difficult and challenging situations. Brief reflection on otherwise you'll all be late for the boat. Very brief reflection. I've just been bowled over by this session and by the breakouts and all the rest of it. And I think, I'm not sure we've absolutely cracked it, but I know AMRA has struggled. We called it the AMRA Institute for a bit and so on. Really like your feedback on how well this has worked for you. We also base some of this on trying to do some survey work before the conference, asking people what sort of issues they wanted brought up. So again, I think the feedback on this and reflecting on it. As far as the sort of wider point, I just come back to something that I hope conscious before I started, which is this idea that the developed world should always teach the developing world what to do is so wrong, because there's so much in a way that if you're, you made the point, Harry, if you've been doing this stuff for a long time, if you've got Malcolm's map and you've got that big red splodge and you do the big green bit and you're stuck doing that, maybe if you're starting from scratch, even with small resources, you may be able to shortcut some of the mistakes that we've made. So there's something about learning on both sides, and I think that what we're hoping to do with AMRA is more connection between one-on-one regulator and another. And my view is certainly that whether you're a big or a small regulator within the developed world, you've got lots to learn by teaming up with and supporting regulators in other parts of the world who may have a lot less resources.
Thank you very much. That's the end. Just really impressive, isn't it, that our takeaway from Malcolm's speech is, are you going to concentrate on the big green blob or the small red ones? He said there would be some takeaways, and that seems to be fantastic.